Bien, a continuación voy a presentar al profesor Paul Sackett. Paul Sackett is professor of the University of Minnesota. His vita is impressive. He has a few important academic awards, a lot of papers published in the most important journals, book chapters, consultancy work, and this is perhaps what more amazes me, in quite different areas: organizational psychology, management, assessment, measurement, and even statistics. For people liking quantitative information, I have extracted from his current vita that he has right now 21 working papers, 9 manuscripts under review, and 6 in press, so 36. His current research interests are these: testing and public policy, personal and situational influences on individual performance in work and educational settings, human judgment processes in personal decision-making, legal and methodological issues in personal selection research, counterproductive work behavior, and the assessment on managerial potential. So, as you see, a lot. So, please, Paul.
Welcome. Thank you so much for inviting me. So happy to have the chance to be here to talk to you. I know the rest of the session today is in Spanish, but this is in English. This is in American English. This is in Minnesota American English. Minnesota, United States, in the middle at the top, where it's very, very cold. Couldn't be more different than Madrid. Okay. This is a talk that I put together at the request of the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology, the big group in the United States. At the conference every year, many people come, and many are practicing psychologists who feel that they get so busy, they have high hopes, good intentions of keeping up with the literature and reading the journals and knowing what's going on, but too busy to do it. And they had a good idea. They said, Paul, how about you go through all the literature and you pull out all the things that you think people should know about and you tell them. And I foolishly agreed to do that and put this together. So the idea was, if someone had just stopped reading the literature, not paid attention for the last 5 years, what would they have missed? And so the idea is what's happened in the testing and assessment literature that applies to psychological assessment in the workplace, that's appeared in our journals, that I think is important, that has some, like I say, implications for practitioners. So this is my personal take on that. So I will touch briefly on a very, very large number of different topics. Each of the little things I talk about, on another day I could happily do the full hour, but this will be just a minute or two, just trying to highlight some things I think are worthy of attention. For everything here, well, you've got the printouts of the references are there. If you want to find the original sources, I direct you to them, so that should work. Okay? So with that in mind, we'll just take it from the top and see how we do. Okay. Topic 1. So there'll be a whole batch of topics, but the first topic is going to be the assessment of personality in workplace settings. And quick overview. Didn't know who our audience was here, but so before I start talking about brand new developments, this is really hard to do, but here's the 1-minute summary of where we stand. One slide is an intro for each of the topics we talk about. So this has emerged as a major research topic in the last 2 decades, which is a real change. When I was a graduate student, I was taught there was no need to learn anything about personality because it's been conclusively proven that there is no important role for personality in the workplace. And then, of course, we've had this big transformation. If you go through the conference programs at the Society for Industrial and Organizational Psychology for the last few years, it's easily the topic that has the most papers. It's great interest to many people. Okay? Driving feature, of course, is the emergence of the Big Five framework. Before we had that framework, it was just such a fragmented, such a different language, and that really brought everything together. There is a large body of validity evidence, and I discover looking through the packet that you're going to hear a summary of some of that a little later this morning, which is wonderful. And the punchline is very, very strong relationships with two important work outcomes, what we call citizenship, organizational citizenship, and the avoidance of counterproductive work behavior. Personality plays a big role there. Weaker relationships with task performance. So if you think about the different components of performance at work, personality is implicated there. The general role we see is not replacing traditional measures of knowledge, skill, and ability, but is supplementing, using in addition to, moving beyond, and like I say, a supplement to measures of knowledge, skill, and ability. In the United States, a very, very big issue is race and ethnicity. We have different racial and ethnic subgroups that are large portions of the population, and there's a lot of concern about adverse impact and group differences between white and black, white, Hispanic, white, Asian. And so there's general interest, and a goal is to find measures where there are small differences. This will avoid the problems that one sees with adverse impact. So small racial and ethnicity differences are seen as a big positive feature for personality assessment. But a big concern is faking, people's ability to distort their responses. And so a lot of what we're going to see here are some really interesting new developments that in very different ways will make a dent in this, will help us address this faking issue. Okay? So that's the overview. That said, let me start on a handful of new developments. The first, topic one, I'll call it a faking-resistant approach to personality measurement. And so this is work done for the United States Army. And in the United States, generally the best testing and assessment work is done in military contexts. They have huge budgets. They have enormous samples. If you say, I want to try it out and I want to give something to, can you get me 10,000 people by next week? They say, sure, we can do that. So those of us who struggle over the course of a year to get 50 or 100 people are envious of the ability of the military to we give orders. You will show up tomorrow morning and you will take the test. They can do that, okay? So anyway, a system with a name that's really fun for Spain. So the Tailored Adaptive Personality Assessment System. The word tapas doesn't mean anything in the United States, but here it is. And this is developed by Fritz Drasgal, professor at the University of Illinois, though he's working privately, not through his Illinois work. And there's a lot of interesting and advanced psychometrics that underlie this that we don't need to know about today, but those of you who are interested, it's a mouthful. Multidimensional pairwise preference format combined with an item response theory. But the notion is, rather than our very traditional method of simply presenting a statement and you say agree or disagree, it's like me, it's not like me, you get, as we see at the bottom, as we see with the little pair, it's the forced choice format. Which is more like you? And you've got a couple of options. People come to me when they want fresh ideas. Most people would say, I'm a good listener. You have to choose which of the two. Now, that approach has a long history. There have been forced choice approaches to personality assessment for a good 50 years. But this takes it several steps further, and the key is the point that I make right here. We're pairing statements. They're similar in two different ways. They're similar in social desirability, and that's the traditional approach. The items are paired. They're equally desirable. It's not easy to see which is the good one to choose. Both are equally good. And also, and this is a psychometric notion, both are, I can't even figure out how my little thing works, similar in this thing called trait location. And this is an item response theory term, and it's just where on a continuum from high to low on the trait does the item fall. By matching on that, which has not been done before, we really move this forward. So it's got some very elaborate psychometric underpinnings, but operationally it looks like a very traditional forced choice measure. And being constructed in this way, it turns out to prove extremely faking resistant. The U.S. Army has attempted to use personality measures for several decades. They keep trying new approaches. They seem to work well in research settings. When they move them into operational use, suddenly all the scores really increase. Faking is an enormous problem. And so now we have research that shows that this measure predicts many things: attrition, failure to turnover, disciplinary incidents, completing training, adjustment to Army life. It predicts a lot of different things, and the Army has made it operational. And interestingly, it is finally they've got something that is continuing to perform well in operational settings. So that was the magic key. Moving out of research settings into operational settings and still faking resistant. And I find this a fascinating development. My prediction is that this kind of technology will become widespread, and this approach will be in a few years used for personality assessment in a great many organizations. So I give you a reference to the Army Technical Report where you can read about this, Drasgow and his colleagues. Okay? So this is what we're going to do. Easily talk to you for an hour about this, but we'll just say this is what's going on, and let's try something else. Okay. Topic 2, contextualized personality items. Okay. Now we have a recent meta-analysis that I find absolutely fascinating, documents that you get much higher predictive power if you, quote, contextualize your items. Ask about behavior at work rather than behavior in general. Let me go back. Let's look at this example here. People come to me when they want fresh ideas. Imagine that you're seeing that item and you're asked, does that describe you? Yes or no? If you see that in general, you say, well, I've got a 13 and a 15-year-old at home, and the two of them don't listen to anything I say. They don't believe I have anything useful to say or do. And you say, no, the people don't turn to me for good ideas. On the other hand, if the question is agree or disagree, people at work come to me when they want fresh ideas. It contextualizes the items. It makes you think about one particular piece of life. It's a really simple idea, but it's really clear that we can be very different people in different contexts. I am seen as a source of good ideas. People value my opinion at work, even if the kids don't value my opinion at home. So the idea is to contextualize the items. And so there's been work doing that, and these people, Schaffer and Postlethwaite, brought together all the studies, and we see them summarized here. Here's the average correlation when it is contextualized versus when it is not. And for each of the big 5 traits, we see considerably higher validity in the contextualized setting than non-contextualized. So here's something that's really simple that anybody can put into operational use without a lot of effort. It's reworking items, and clearly one would need to reassess and revalidate, but to me this is a really important step forward, the possibility of incremental predictive value by focusing explicitly on seeking people's responses to describe themselves at work. Okay? Good. Number 3, next within the personality domain. I said at the very beginning, and we all understand this, that the big 5 has been the driving force for the resurgence of personality. And so we started with hundreds, if not thousands, of different personality trait labels. We converged on the big 5, and now we've come to realize we converged perhaps a little too much. 5 is maybe a little too coarse. And there's emerging evidence that you need to be a little more fine-grained than just 5. Here's one example that I think this is my personal belief is the best work out there. Colin DeYoung, who happens to be my colleague at Minnesota, and his colleagues offer a very, very useful attempt to take each of the big 5 and simply split them into 2. And what I'm going to suggest is that you read these, you should immediately say, oh yes, I see how the two things, that the 2 different versions are quite different. Let's take neuroticism or emotional stability, whichever label you give it, the positive or negative pole. He says there's 2 pieces of this, and the first he calls volatility, irritability, anger, difficulty controlling emotions. Okay, that's one piece of emotional stability. And the other, withdrawal, anxiety, worry, depression, sadness, that's another piece. Clearly, one is external, towards others. One is internal. The 2 are quite different. And a score that doesn't differentiate those loses a lot of information. So DeYoung has developed measures that simply differentiate there. And we can go through each of them in the same way. Agreeableness, which he splits into compassion, which is empathy and understanding and insight into the other, versus politeness and consideration. You can have one without the other. You can be high in either. So, conscientiousness, which he breaks into a hard work piece and avoiding distraction, and another which is the orderliness. Okay? So the notion of going beyond simply the big five. And I see that as a growing trend. So I'm using this just to illustrate this trend. Here's my next illustration of the same thing. The best work to date has been done on the trait of conscientiousness. And so this is a meta-analysis by Dudley and colleagues. And they said they looked at all the measures out there of conscientiousness and find that they argue for 4 subfacets: achievement striving, dependability, order, and cautiousness. And they found that the validity was driven by the achievement piece and the dependability piece. Cautiousness and orderliness have virtually no predictive power. So if you use a full-range conscientiousness measure, imagine you use a 50-item measure with 10 or 12 items each for achievement, dependability, order, and cautiousness, you're wasting half your items. You would have much more predictive power if you gave twice as many achievement items, twice as many dependability items, got a more robust, more reliable measure. And a little more detail, the achievement facet has the dominant weight for predicting task performance. Dependability has the dominant weight in predicting the avoidance of counterproductive work behavior. So it depends on what your goal, what you're trying to predict. But the notion being, we can do better than we currently do if we focus our measures on the facets of the trait that prove predictive in the workplace setting. If you want to simply describe people, yes, there are 4 facets to conscientiousness. We don't deny that. But if you want to predict workplace behavior, 2 of those facets are important, 2 of those facets are not. The fact that someone's desk is clean has no real value in the workplace. The question is, what do you get done? Is this making sense? You with me? Cool. Okay. Topic 4. Lots of stuff in the personality domain, so I've got a lot of little things to say here. The use of what I'm going to call real-time faking warnings. We'd said a big problem is faking. We've already seen one approach that attempts to deal with that through the TAPIS, the forced choice system. Here's another approach that I was part of some of that work. The notion these days, since a large number of personality assessments are administered on a computer, so they can be scored in real time on the internet. So the issue is, what happens if we look at a pattern of responses to the initial set of items, and if early patterns of responses seem to suggest a pattern that looks like one is engaging in social desirability or faking, can we intervene, deliver a warning to people? You're giving a pattern of responses that is generally consistent with attempts to create an overly favorable image. We are going to return you to the top of the test and ask you to try again and encourage you to respond honestly. So a warning that is administered in real time based on a diagnostic, based on the pattern of results that people are producing as they take the test. 2 studies have appeared in our journals in the last couple years. The first, Richard Landers, a student of mine. So we'd given 1/3 of the items, and we looked at the pattern after the first third and delivered a warning if people were exhibiting a particularly strong pattern of response that our label was blatant extreme responding. It's a pattern of responses that so clearly indicates faking. And after the warning, we were able to reduce that response pattern substantially. The second is a study done in China, Fan et al. So, like many, you've got a social desirability scale embedded in your personality measure. And so they are scoring that in real time, Anyone who is exceeding a particular threshold on the social desirability scale gets a warning, and it goes back to the top. Same idea as Landers. Here's a slide with their results. We've got two lines here. We got the open circles at the bottom are the people who were not showing social desirability. So they took the test twice. They weren't showing social desirability. Of course, their scores are the same both times. Then in dark circles, we see the group that initially was scoring very high on social desirability. They were given the warning after time 1, retook the test at time 2. So you see a big reduction in social desirable responding after the warning. So there's this sense that warnings can have an effect and can be very useful. So with our technology for administering measures, if we're scoring in real time, we can intervene. Okay? Whoops, references are there. A little bit more about this idea of faking warnings. My colleague Nathan Kunsel at the University of Minnesota has done some very, very nice work that I find very, very useful for conceptually. It says, what are the goals that a test taker has when they're sitting down to take an employment test? And Nathan argues, and I will agree with him, I think it's really useful, simple but useful, that generally people have 3 goals. One is to be impressive. They want to impress the company. They want to make a good impression. They want to get hired. Second, they want to be credible. They want to be believable. They've got to deliver a picture of themselves that they can live up to. Okay? Note that these two are clearly at odds. Actions you take to be impressive may be contrary to actions you take to be credible. You can't claim to be an extreme extrovert if, in fact, you are extremely shy and retiring. And a third possible goal is being true to yourself. The notion of just, I can't live with myself if I try to present myself in a way that I know isn't true. Now, the argument is people differ on these, and they may differ from time of day in terms of which of these is foremost in their mind. Sometimes you're more concerned about being impressive. Sometimes you're more concerned about being credible. Our sense is we want people to be concerned about being credible. So a little study that I was a part of, we said the psychological term priming, if we can prime concern for being credible, maybe we can reduce faking. So what we did was just before people took the personality assessment, we told them there will be a follow-up interview. Tell us what times you're available. You have to pick a time on a time slot. So they're very conscious. I'm going to meet with someone who's going to be following up, and I'm going to have to behave in a way that's consistent with the way I respond on the personality assessment. And so one group of people scheduled a follow-up interview 1 minute before they took the assessment, the other didn't, and substantial reduction in social desirability score among the people who had been primed to realize I should be thinking about being credible. Someone's going to follow up. Something very simple, something anyone could do. Okay? So it seems we've got a number of things that are possible for helping us have some effect on the faking issue. Okay. So that's a whole bunch of things on the personality topic. And then a little bit on cognitive ability. There's not that much that's new in cognitive ability. It's well established. Here again, my quick overview, as always. The general literature summary says cognitive ability is generally the best predictor of task performance for jobs where training is provided after hire. If you're hiring somebody and you're going to train them after you hire them, the cognitive ability test is your single best bet. If you're hiring individuals already trained, you want to use a job-specific knowledge and skill measure rather than a measure of general cognitive ability in general. Okay? It's not a strong predictor of citizenship and counterproductive behavior, so it's a fine predictor of task performance, but very useful not to just say performance. Performance isn't one thing. We've got to always be thinking, are we talking task performance? Are we talking being a good citizen in the organization? Are we talking avoiding counterproductive behavior? The big issue, big in the United States, is the large mean differences between white and black applicants and white and Hispanic applicants, leading to what our literature calls the performance diversity dilemma. Organizations want high performers, but they also want a diverse workplace. They want to hire a workplace that mimics their local population, so they do not want to use selection devices that would screen out racial and ethnic minority candidates. And so these large differences on the cognitive ability tests have been the big concern for the longest time. So the thing that I need to mention, just because it's so jarring and so different from what we've seen before, is some evidence of a cognitive test with reduced adverse impact. And in the Society for Industrial Organizational Psychology in the United States gives an annual award for the best piece of applied research. And in 2011, they gave that award to Ken Yusko and his colleagues for the development of something that they call the Siena reasoning test. Now, this is a nonverbal reasoning test. So the idea is you're using unfamiliar item content. For example, made-up words. So reasoning of the sort. So these are words that don't exist. If a gath is larger than a shet and a shet is smaller than a thal, what's the relationship between a gath and a thal? That standard kind of reasoning. The concept, adverse impact, would be reduced by eliminating test content with which groups have differential familiarity. Okay, so if you're taking a language load out, and they find evidence of much smaller mean differences. We use the D statistic as the mean difference in standard deviation units. For the Siena test, it comes in the 0.3 to 0.4 range, as opposed to the 1.0 range one sees for traditional cognitive tests. They've got a lot of validity evidence. It seems to work well. One thing that I found very impressive, an independent study of an important testing organization in the United States called HUMRO, Human Resource Research Organization, included the Siena test along with another traditional test, found validity a little bit higher for the other test, 45 for the other, 35 for this Siena test, but the standard, one full standard deviation, black-white difference for the traditional test, and 0.38 for this Siena test. So in a head-to-head comparison, same group, same test, we see the smaller differences. So this is getting a lot of attention because how are they doing it and why they're doing it, I have to say I find a puzzle. Their argument is we're getting the smaller difference because we're using content that's not familiar to the candidates. It's new and novel. But frankly, we've been doing that for a long time. We have a long history of using nonverbal reasoning tests, the Ravens matrices, for those who know that, lots of large-scale military studies. Project A is this enormous military project trying out an extensive array of possible tests. But so these others that have the same rationale don't show the reduced group difference that the Siena test shows. My personal theory, I haven't proved this conclusively, but I've done some simulation work that it seems to hold. I believe that the key to this may be item difficulty. The easier the test, the smaller the subgroup difference, and I think that this Siena test is designed to be quite simple. The way it works is it differentiates among people at the low end of the score range, does not differentiate well at the high end of the score range, and for a number of testing applications that works well. If the purpose of your test is to eliminate or screen out only candidates at the low end rather than to identify those at the high end, you don't need differentiation at the high end. So it's just so novel and so different in its pattern of findings that I thought we need to be aware of. So the interesting and frustrating thing is it's received this award from PSYOP as the best work that they've seen, despite the fact that nothing has been published, nothing has gone through the peer review process. If you Google Siena reasoning test, you'll find PowerPoints from some presentations. That's the only information that I can provide to you. There is nothing yet in our journals about it. New developments in situational judgment testing. Okay, and again, I understand that if people were at this conference last year or the year before, you would have heard from my frequent collaborator, Philip Levens, about situational judgment tests. But the quick summary of, for example, just the idea of you get a little scenario, followed by a choice of options. I won't read it aloud, you can take a look. But you should get the idea of what's going on. Here's a bunch of courses of action. Now, there's lots of variance on situational judgment tests. The way this one is written is, which of the following would be most effective? So that's asking, what should you do? What's the best thing to do? Others will use a different format, not what's the best, but what would you do? What would you do? What should you do? Key distinction. Other options, we've got all these options. One is pick the best option. Another is evaluate the quality of each of the options. So there's lots of questions about how best to do this. But situational judgment tests, at least in the United States, are the single biggest change to operational selection practices in the United States. These, in the last 15 years, have become very, very widespread. Everywhere I turn, I'm hearing about people adding situational judgment tests to their screening batteries. So this has become very, very big business. Okay. Again, the quick summary of key findings, there's a lot of validity evidence. Now, you can use these to measure different things. You can build a situational judgment test to measure problem solving. You can build one to measure communication skills. You can build one to measure integrity. So it's not one thing, it's a method. The idea of a scenario and a course of action. There's a lot of evidence of incremental validity above and beyond both ability and personality. The attractive feature of generally small subgroup differences or small ethnic differences. Items can be presented in written form, like the example I showed you, or in video. Recently, we see a move to animation rather than recording live actors, which is one of the features contributing to the widespread use. It's become very easy and cheap to use animated figures, cartoon figures, rather than live actors, which is very expensive to present scenarios in these situational judgment tests. But so that's the overview, and so things that have happened there. Okay. First, Philip Levens is the lead on this. It's work we did together. I mentioned this debate about what would you do versus what should you do. Would do gets a typical performance. And everyone agrees that's what we wish we could get. What I want to learn from a candidate is what they would do. So everyone says, I want to assess what they would do. Should do is more a knowledge test, maximum. Would do is seen as fakeable, right? If they ask, what would you do? And you say, here's a scenario where there's a difficult problem at work, and should you confront a poor performer about their work performance? And you would say, yes, I know that I should. The right thing to do is to confront this poor performer about their performance. But many people say, in my heart of hearts, I'm going to wait a while and hope maybe the problem goes away. So the difference between what you would do and what you know you should do is substantial. And you know that they want you to, the right answer is to say I would confront. So there's this concern about fakeability. And what we were able to do with the Belgian medical school applicants, I was amazed. You could never do this study in the United States. We're not permitted to do random assignment of people to different conditions in operational testing, but we were able to do it in Belgium. So candidates were taking this interpersonal skills situational judgment test, and so they're randomly assigned to take it under what would you do instructions or what should you do to see what would happen. And it didn't make any difference. In research settings, would do and should do give you radically different things. In operational settings, everyone effectively gives should do. Everybody says, I know what the right answer is, and I'm going to tell you what it is. So if they know the right answer, they'll tell it. And so I think this has really important implications. The thing that we'd like to know what someone would do, but in reality, we can't get that. All we can get is, do you know what you should do? And you have to settle for that and call that good enough. The person who doesn't even know what you should do is the person you screen out. So the argument that I've been recommending to the clients I work with, I think we've now resolved this. Do a should-do format. It eliminates the faking issue and lets us move forward. Okay. I also mentioned the different ways you can respond to situational judgment tests. Here's an absolutely beautiful new study. Again, I'm amazed. It's wonderful that Winfred Arthur was able to do this. 3 options. First, rate the effectiveness of each response. Here's 4 options. Rate each one on a scale from how good or how bad is this course of action. A second would be rank order those options, A, B, C, or D. Which of those 4 responses is the best thing to do? Or choose the best, choose the worst. He was able to get a large consultancy firm to cooperate. They had a 20-item situational judgment test, and they obtained a nice sample, 30,000 job applicants. This is administered online. They get about 10,000 people completing this assessment per week. This is a very large operation. So week 1, they had people rate the effectiveness of each response. Week 2, 10,000 people rank ordered the responses. Week 3, 10,000 people did choose the best, choose the worst. So you can see what happens. It's a spectacular study. And again, we now have an answer. Rate each response is superior on virtually every dimension we can look at. Gives you higher reliability, lower correlation with cognitive ability, which is good. You were trying to measure something different from cognitive ability. Smaller mean difference by gender. Didn't have good information about race and ethnicity. Higher correlation with conceptually relevant personality dimensions. Some follow-up in a smaller sample, higher retest reliability, more favorable reactions. So this ongoing debate, what's the best thing to do? I think we've got some really good information from a really, really large-scale study. So if I've got to put together an SJT today, I say I now know something I didn't know a few years ago. Ask people, what should you do? How good are each of these responses? There's a just published study that I find fascinating and really, really interesting. Crum et al., the University of Berlin. He and his colleagues questioned how situational is situational judgment. The suggestion was maybe SJTs really just measure general knowledge about appropriate social behavior. Okay? So they did something that I found pretty interesting or clever, their term. They decapitated the SJT items. Don't know if that's an English word that's messy, but what it means is they removed the stem. They didn't tell you the story. They just said, here's 4 options, A, B, C, and D. Which is the best thing to do? Okay? Without reading the story. Does it make sense? You understand what I'm saying? So their term, decapitate. Remove the stem, just present the responses. Very, very interesting sample. They got airline pilots. And they had the airline pilots. This is also nice. So 3 different SJTs. One about airline pilot knowledge, one about integrity, one about teamwork. So they're sampling different domains. And overall, what I have to highlight and they don't highlight, mean scores are 1 standard deviation higher with the stem. If you see the stem, you do a lot better. So to me, that makes sense. They don't call attention to that, so I'm arguing with them. What they do is interesting, but they miss some of the truth here. For more than half the items, there's no difference in the likelihood of getting it right if you see the stem or if you don't. So an awful lot of SJT items, there's no useful information contained in the little story up front. It's just generalized information about what's a good thing to do, what's a bad thing to do. But so they call attention to that, and the general argument is that the stem isn't important. I call attention to the overall. Mean scores a standard deviation higher with the stem. So sometimes it matters a lot, and I agree, sometimes it doesn't. Future work has got to sort out under what circumstances can you save a lot of administration time by not making people read a detailed story? Are there certain facets that you can get at with just this much simpler response format? So it seems to depend on the specificity of the STEM content. Sometimes it's a very, very specific story. Sometimes it's very general. We saw here it was airline pilots and integrity and teamwork. This is a lot of words, but I'm going to put this up here. Here's an example of an SJT item that is extremely, extremely specific. If you just start reading, By the time you're 3 or 4 lines into this, you realize this is technical, there's a lot of information there. You cannot do without the setup. The setup tells you all the important things that would tell a pilot, should I do A, B, C, or D? So there certainly are times where the STEM is important and contains a lot of information, and the key seems to be how the specificity of the item. So in very, very specific items, the whole thing matters. For other SJTs that are much more general and generic, dealing with interpersonal skills, there may be certain things that are always good to do. You don't even need to know the story. If you see, a particular option is option C, well, that's something you should never do no matter what. So I thought that was interesting. Okay, so here's citations for these different things in the situational judgment domain. Okay. Integrity testing. I wanted to mention the integrity testing field. Again, my quick overview. So integrity tests, very, very widely used in the United States. These are self-report measures that are designed to predict counterproductive behavior. So they're generally used for very low-level jobs, commonly in retail settings where people have access to money, merchandise, where there's concern about theft, and so an attempt to screen individuals on likelihood of engaging in wrongdoing, misbehavior at work. Generally, it's seen as there's 2 different categories, 2 different types of tests. The first goes under, sometimes it's called an overt or a clear purpose test. And it would have questions like, what percentage of people do you think steal from their employer? How severely should someone be punished for stealing a small amount of money? Now, the general idea, it's pretty straightforward, is people have a fundamental need to feel good about themselves. I think we'll just take that as a starting premise. So people who engage in wrongdoing at work, they still need to feel okay about themselves, and they develop a set of attitudes that help them self-justify, which are, everybody does it. I'm not doing anything that's wrong or bad. So responses to a percent of people who steal from their employer, everybody does it. That's sort of a hint that you are engaged in those self-justifications. So that's the idea behind this from the folks who developed these. So, and the second, punitiveness. Should someone be punished? So different kinds of questions about different kinds of behavior, and an argument that, no, that's not a big, bad, not a bad thing. It's okay. So that's the idea behind these overt tests. The other are generally called personality-based or disguised purpose tests. A person who took this, if you said, what was this trying to measure? They probably couldn't tell you. They would just say personality. It looks like any other Big Five measure, but there's items within it that are scored for predicting counterproductive behavior. Sample item, and this is the single item. This is the single item that's your best predictor. If somebody told me, Paul, you need to predict whether someone's going to engage in wrongdoing at work, and you can ask them only one question, ask them this one. Agree or disagree, I would do anything on a dare. The person who says, yeah, that's very, very high risk. But anyway, so those are the types of tests. So that's my quick overview to set you up if you're not following that literature. This was a field where we thought we really understood things. We thought it was done. We thought it was set. But now, 20 years ago, Owens, Viswesvaran, and Schmidt, 1993, classic analysis of integrity test validity. Huge meta-analysis. At the time, I think it was the largest meta-analysis ever done, that they were able to find 662 validity studies, and it was a very, very impressive piece of work. And I still agree, it's a very impressive piece of work. And so they found many, many unpublished studies. They contacted test publishers. Test publishers gave them lots of data. Often it wasn't even a published work. Often they just got raw data from test publishers that had never been written up. They analyzed it themselves. So they worked very, very hard and got all this information. Okay. And this was written up in 1993 with very, very positive findings that integrity tests predict counterproductive behavior at a quite high level. And that's sort of been the gold standard. After 662 validity studies, people said, okay, we got the answer. And recently, in 2012, we had a follow-up Chad Van Eydeking and colleagues, he said, it's been 20 years, it's time for an updated meta-analysis. And it came out very differently. Now, lots of things happened differently. They said, we're only going to include in our analysis studies that are reported in detail, where you've got a write-up. It's public information. Anybody can look at it. Anybody can read it. Anybody can verify. Our professional standards and principles say you should do that. Information in scientific reports should be available for review. So by focusing on only studies where the information is available to anyone, instead of 662, they've only got 104 studies with 132 samples. They were not successful. Test publishers all said, we don't want to cooperate with this because we like the finding from the earlier Viswesvarant study. And so they did not get a lot of sharing of unpublished information. Okay. And so here's the punchline. Owens et al., mean validity for these overt tests, 39. For the personality-based tests, 29. Van Eydeking comes in with a value of 11. And this number of studies, which is K, is much smaller than the overall. This is a focus on what they call the highest quality studies, a predictive validity study in an operational setting rather than something in a research setting. So we've got radically different findings. Okay. And we don't really know why. It's not clear. The big problem turns out to be the fact that we need all the information about studies not available for public scrutiny. I can't complain about Owens. I think it's wonderful that she went out and contacted all these publishers and got all this unpublished data and all this raw data. At one level, that's neat, but part two of that would be we've got to get permission to make that available for others to review. And without that, I can't tell. I don't know why. So clearly there's going to be further work done to scrutinize. But this really raises important questions about data openness. What are the obligations of a test publisher to share data broadly, not only selectively with certain people? What are researcher obligations to share information? What are journal publication standards? Some are arguing that we should only publish a meta-analysis that includes studies where the information about each study is available to all. So I think it's an important issue, and so we're calling attention to it. Making sense? We good? Okay. Vocational interest. There's something that's pretty different. This is another one. The quick overview, once again, self-report measures of your interests in various activities and occupations. Long history of doing this. This goes back a century or more. Widely used for counseling and guidance, and everyone agrees that it's an extraordinarily useful thing for those counseling and guidance purposes. Now the question is there any value in using scores from these vocational interest inventories for personnel selection? Can you use it for some predictive purpose? Okay. And the general conclusion had been no. Big review, Hunter and Hunter in 1984. Hunter and Hunter reviewed the validity of many different selection procedures. This was updated by Schmidt and Hunter in 1998. But Hunter and Hunter said the grand average, the validity for interest inventories for predicting performance is 0.10. And people said 0.10, that's really low. And we sort of shut the book on it. And there has not been work on it since, for the most part. On the other hand, how many studies were in that meta-analysis? The answer is 3. It's really startling to, if you, they couldn't find much work, and they said, well, there's 3, and the average validity is 10, but it is only 3. Now, again, this fellow we mentioned before, this guy's been busy, this Van Eydeking, who's a very good guy, who had studied integrity, also has this very interesting recent study on vocational interest. So he's been able to hunt down 80 studies, which is sure a lot better than 3. And he comes up with a really interesting finding. It looks just like Hunter and Hunter. If you compute a grand average, the mean validity for a single interest dimension is 11. If you just say, what's your score on the artistic interests factor, and how well does that score correlate with job performance, you get 11. But that's really a meaningless question. The question you want to ask is, we want to choose interest dimensions that are conceptually relevant to the job in question. Artistic interests have a lot to do with some jobs, nothing at all to do with other jobs. A single interest dimension that's relevant to the job in question, 23. So we got scores on a variety, if there's multiple relevant dimensions. So the argument is there's a lot more here than we had thought. So in the United States, we're seeing at this point modest, but a resurgence of interest, and I think we're going to see it growing in the potential of interest measures for shedding light on personnel selection procedures. Important caveat, at this point, all the data, almost all the data, is collected for research purposes. In the same way that we have concern about faking in the personality domain, we have that same concern about faking in the interest domain. If you're taking a vocational interest inventory as a student, looking for help and what should I do with my life? What's a good job for me? Okay, there's no incentive to fake that. But if you're taking it saying, they're giving this to me to see if I fit this job as a public accountant, you may be sitting here saying, what patterns of responses fit at least my mental model of what a public accountant is? I think what we're going to see, that the next generation is, in the same way we've seen it in the personality domain, faking resistant measures of personality. I think we're going to see that in the interest domain. I think we're going to see some of the same technologies that we saw in personality. They'll be moved to and applied to vocational interests. Okay? Okay. And the references for that. A very, very quick mention of new developments in using social media. I put this together without knowing the rest of the program for today and arrived to see the program, and I'm delighted to see that a little later this morning you're going to have a wonderful session on use of social media. So I'm going to give you the 1 minute and then you'll get much more. Maybe I should even skip it and leave it for but all I want to do is to say has become a quick overview. This has become widespread. I mean, surveys of most United States employers will report that they look at information about job candidates online. They will Google the candidate's name to see what comes up. They will look at their Facebook pages. Some will ask a job applicant, give me your password so I can see your Facebook page. So the term cyber vetting is the... so the surveys will show 80% and some numbers like that of employers do it. Generally a search for negative information. You're looking for some reason something embarrassing, something that could be troubling that you're going to screen out. But generally, we know it's widespread, but now shifting to the perspective of what we do, we evaluate the quality, what is the predictive value of the information that comes this way, where are we? And so I just wanted to report that we are now beginning to see studies of that sort. And so I like the idea of doing that, even though it's still at the beginning stages. Two things that I'll quickly say. There certainly is meaningful information. For example, personality comes through online. We can, very interesting work, and it's generally Sam Gosling and Simone Vizier and their colleagues, that you can make some pretty good judgments about an individual's personality from social network information. And extroversion is the easiest thing to judge, neuroticism the hardest, but one can do that. So there is a signal there. You can learn something about a person from online information. But in terms of is this predictive of job performance, the first, what I'm calling, that I'm aware of, I got to say that I'm aware of, I could have missed it. I'm scanning our journals, what's showing up in our journals. The first, and it's currently in press, so you can find it online, but it hasn't actually been published. The first really good study at prediction of job performance. I think this is a really wonderful study, and once again, it's this Van Eydeking guy. So he's doing wonderful work in many different domains. So students who are about to finish the university agreed to make their Facebook information available, and recruiters looked at the Facebook profile and made ratings on a set of 10 dimensions. These people completed university, went into the workplace. Van Eydeking followed up and got supervisor performance ratings a year later and found the ratings that recruiters made of the Facebook information did not predict. It's one study, it's one setting. It's a high-quality study. It's really nicely done. We're going to be seeing lots more of this, but the idea of moving beyond, isn't this interesting, to attempting to do some systematic evaluation is the kind of thing we're starting to see here, and I'm really happy to see it. Okay? Boom. Okay. And this is going to turn out to be the last of my topics, the distribution of job performance. What do I mean by that? This is some provocative work that I just wanted to talk about. Is job performance normally distributed, is the key question. And we have implicitly, as a field, the field of psychology in the workplace, has assumed this for many, many years. Often it's implicit. We use data analysis strategies that assume normality. Our formal models for evaluating selection system utility assume normality. So we don't talk about it, but it's there. If it were not the case, we'd have to revisit an awful lot of things. And a paper was published in 2012 by O'Boyle and Agunis, and they claim we're offering hundreds of data sets, all consistently showing that performance is not normally distributed. It follows something they call a power law, a distribution with the largest number of observations at the very bottom, the number of observations then dropping rapidly. That's a mouthful. Here's the picture. So here's a distribution of a sample of 5,000 people overlaid. Those 5,000 people distributed normally. Those 5,000 people distributed following a power curve. High number at one point, slow diminish. So their argument is, in fact, there's a very, very small number of very, very high performers. There's a big clustering, but the curve looks, as they're showing us here, not at all normal. And so they put this out, and this article got an incredible amount of attention in the United States. I mean, generally articles in our journals are read by psychologists, and that's about it. And this got discussed in the news media everywhere, and it got attention of the sort that one rarely sees, which got me concerned, and I worried, and I took a close look, and I want to be critical of it and tell you something. Now, what's the data? They said we're looking at hundreds of data sets. They did look at hundreds of data sets. But they said almost all of our studies, performance is measured by a supervisory rating. And they said we can't look at those ratings data because, at least in the United States, many of those ratings are forced to fit a normal distribution. Organizations will tell supervisors, you must rate a certain number of people high, you must give a certain number of low. So it's often forced to fit a normal. So if we want to ask the question, is performance really normal, you can't look at ratings. So I will agree with them on that that's a problem. So they said, well, we're going to turn to objective data. And that's a good idea. But they had looked at what I'm going to call some very non-traditional measures. It's performance in some ways, but it sure isn't traditional. So they said, well, here's performance of academic scholars, publication in journals, the rate of publication. So for each person, we can measure the number of journal articles you publish, and we can look at the distribution of publication in journals. Let's look at sports performance. Pick golf, pick basketball, pick football, pick anything. We can look at the distribution of many of the indices that are available there, points scored. They looked at the distribution of awards. I presume that the American Academy Awards for movies, that's shown worldwide, that comes to you, yes. But till we can get the number of awards people have won, political elections, number of terms to which one's been elected. So that's the nature of the kinds of data. I will agree it's very creative. They went looking for something where we got an objective measure of performance, but I'm going to argue that the things they looked at got them into trouble in some very important ways. Here is a different way of looking at it. When we say job performance, what do we mean? And I think we have to be careful. We don't just toss out the word. This is from a recent handbook of work and organizational psychology published in the United States. Steve Motto-Whitlow, a very, very prominent scholar, and he's got this very careful definition. Job performance is the total expected value of the discrete behavioral episodes an individual carries out over a standard period of time. There's a lot there. Total value of the whole bunch of behavioral episodes. We do lots of individual things, but performance is the sum of all of them. That's important. And the other important thing is over a standard period of time. And I'm going to argue that these authors, Agunis and O'Boyle, completely missed the boat on these critical factors and giving them some very distorted findings. So, for example, if you look at an individual behavior, and O'Boyle did a lot of that, look at individual behavior. So here's a study of mine of counterproductive work behavior. It's a big study, large sample. I've got 35 different counterproductive work behaviors, and people will rate this is self-report, how often do they engage in each of them. On the left side is the pattern we see for any individual item. On a 1, 2, 3, 4, for I've never done it, I've done it once, I've done it more than once, I do it a lot. Sure enough, it looks just like that power law. It just looks just like that O'Boyle and Nagunis say it should. Right? Single discrete behavior. If I add up all 35 counterproductive work behaviors and come up with the total value, all of the things you do, you see the picture on the right. There's my distribution of the sum of all 35. Suddenly it becomes normal or close to it. I'm not arguing for precise normal, but normal is a much better approximation to what we see than their story about a power law. Does that make sense? You understand that? Okay. The second thing you've got to do is it's important to look at all performers. You can't select only the elite. And I worry they did that. When they say, let's look at professional athletes, let's look at award winners for Academy Awards. My personal interest is long-distance running. I've done that forever, so I said, well, look, I'm going to use that as an example. If you look at, if I have on the right, elite athletes, these are marathon runners who are good enough to qualify to run in the Olympics. There's the distribution of their performance quality, and sure enough, it looks like that power law. On the left, someone in the United States runs a website where they collect every information on every individual who completes a marathon in the United States. So this is the distribution of every single person. And it looks much closer to normal. You see a little tail at the end. That tail would be disabled wheelchair athletes, people taking much longer time than usual. Set those aside, you've got something very normal. Again, including everyone, then focusing only on a subset. And then the single piece that's most critical, that's most wrong with their analysis, is we need to equalize the opportunity to perform. That Mata-Widlow definition said performance is the value of all your work behaviors over a common period of time. And that's what O'Boyle and Nagunis did not do. Let's take their first one. It's publications by scholars. Well, they just took each person who's ever published in a given journal and asked how many articles did each person publish. So my graduate student who's just published their first article in their first year in the field gets a tally of one article, and I just hit the 40th anniversary of publishing my first journal article. It's not at all fair to compare my total with my student's total and say which one's the better performer, because we're not holding the time to perform constant. Does that make sense? It's worthwhile to look at career achievement and ask about that, but that's a different variable than performance, which is holding opportunity to perform constant. Here we just said, let's take a look at, this is sports data, and I'll describe it. The message comes through. On the top, we have basketball. This is professional basketball, the NBA. It's the distribution of points scored. And sure enough, it looks like it follows that strange distribution. But if we equalize the opportunity to perform and make it points scored per minute that you're on the court, you get the right. Total points scored, points per minute. Next is American football. The unit of measurement is something called a touchdown, call it a goal. Ooh, it looks like the power law, but if you make it per unit of time, it becomes normal. Below is ice hockey. Don't know if you play ice hockey. I had the television on last night, and I saw something that looked like hockey on indoors on skates. I'd never seen that before. In America, in Minnesota, where it's cold, we would do that on ice. But anyway, so this is ice hockey. And again, goals scored per minute. Again, the whole story that it's not normal is a is a mistake from not taking into account this critical idea that we must take into account the period of time. So the argument that they've made and that gets all this media attention, that everything we've always thought about performance is wrong and every finding in our journals needs to be redone. I mean, they really were making grand claims. I think it's all noise. If one is just careful about what you mean by performance, you see that it will all sort itself out. I look at the clock and say I've used my allocated time. I want to thank you for being patient, quiet, and I hope that you could. I hope my English was okay, that you could understand it, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you. Thank you.